true God emanating certain forms that were called the aeons, all of which were pure goodness. But one of these, Sophia, who's also associated with wisdom, fell. And here's the really controversial thing about the Gnostics, and this is why the Christians started burning them at the stake, even though arguably Gnosis was the original form of Christianity. Because the Gnostics say that that entity, who the Old Testament calls Yahweh or Jehovah, he was the demiurge. They say he's not a real God at all. They say that the real God is far beyond that, and the creature that we've been taught to worship as a God is not God at all. He's some pumped up supernatural entity who wants to be admired and worshipped and adored, and has this huge ego and enchains human beings as his eternal servants, and created entities called archons, evil angels, to keep mankind in chains. And certain teachers were sent to free us from the control of this demiurge. And one of those entities was Christ. The Gnostics saw Jesus Christ as the greatest Gnostic teacher who was sent to liberate us from the control of the demiurge. And you know, it's true. If you look at the behavior of the church, it's very different from anything that Christ says. Nowhere in the words of Christ, anywhere in the gospel, will you find Christ telling us to burn people at the stake, for example. No way. Christ is a beautiful, beautiful figure who brings true knowledge, true gnosis to the world. And he has, in a sense, been hijacked by the money men and the bureaucrats and the power mongers of the church in a misleading process. And Gnosticism, because it saw this clear, was one of the first victims of that fanatical literalist faction in the church that became the Roman Catholic Church, and united with the power of Rome to crush ancient Egypt. The Gnostics were the first to be burnt at the stake in terrible, terrible ways for their beliefs, and went underground. And it's interesting that how the Gnostics take some of the familiar stories from the Bible, and again, this is of course highly heretical material. So the Gnostics, just as they turned the Garden of Eden story upside down, they turned the flood story upside down as well. It wasn't to punish evil, as the Old Testament tells us, but to punish humanity for having risen so high, and to take the light, the gnosis that was growing amongst men. And the Gnostic texts say the survivors were thrown into great distraction and into a life of toil, so that mankind might be occupied with worldly affairs and might not have the opportunity of being devoted to the Holy Spirit. And, you know, throughout history, those who have sought the liberating gnosis, the light, the knowledge of the true nature of things, have been subjected to persecution. And I just want to briefly touch on the tragic story of the Cathars, who lived in what is now southwest France, in the area called the Languedoc, and who undoubtedly were a Gnostic form of Christianity. They held the figure of Christ in the highest order, and for him he was, as I mentioned earlier, the supreme Gnostic teacher. But on the other hand, the Cathars regarded the Pope in Rome as the devil's agent on earth. And they utterly opposed the rule of the popes. And for that, the Gnostics earned the anger of the Roman Catholic Church. Unlike Roman Catholicism of that period, which wanted to keep the populace ignorant and illiterate, the Cathars promoted universal literacy. They believed in the absolute equality of men and women. They were the first paper makers in Europe because they were so keen on literacy. It really was truly a liberating doctrine that was taught in Catharism. And they created a wonderful, free, creative, artistic society. You've heard of the troubadours? They came from the Languedoc. They were originally from the Cathars. But as they flourished and grew, the Church of Rome became more and more angry with them. And finally it sent a crusade against them. And that's called the Albigensian Crusades, because Albi was one of the cities in the Languedoc. And this was a terrible, terrible thing that happened back there in France in the 1200s. Terrible things were done to the Cathars. This entire religion, this entire culture, this entire way of life was utterly destroyed. Tens of thousands of people were murdered. Whole cities were razed to the ground. There was burning at the stake at an enormous scale. The books of the Cathars were all destroyed. I mean, just the worst thing that you can possibly imagine took place and happened to them. And by the mid-13th century, they were gone. They were utterly wiped out. And their memory would almost be lost to mankind. So that's what happens when you try to practice this ancient wisdom tradition that took the form of Gnosticism. You are in danger. And from the Gnostic point of view, the demiurge and his archons and their human servants, they're always trying to steal the light. And they're certainly trying to do so today. And if the light is growing amongst mankind, as I believe it is, then we can be sure that tremendous archonic forces are at work in the world to suppress it. We shouldn't close our eyes to this. We all want everything to be goodness, but we shouldn't close our eyes to the existence of evil. And we have to be alert and we have to be strong in order to confront that wickedness.
Some kind of Gnostic demon. It's some kind of cannibalistic demiurge that should be thoroughly renounced and rejected.